Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to start diving into the concept of measurement theory. We're going to take a little closer look at the idea of operationalization and how we operationalize constructs. We're going to go a little bit more into what exactly is measurement theory. And then we're definitely going to take the first look into two of the most important components of conducting research and collecting data. And those are all about these things called reliability and validity. The two lectures that will follow this will go deeper into both reliability and validity. We're also going to talk about the different components of measurement. So if we're going out into the world and collecting information about a certain topic, we want to make sure that we're collecting good data. So we have to consider, how do I collect it? What are the strengths and weaknesses of different things? And so that components of measurement will come into that. And then we'll also give a brief overview of the different types of measurements that are out there. Now, obviously, this is not going to be an in-depth discussion about types of measure, but it gives us a pretty good idea of where we're headed. The readings that are associated with this are Chapter 5 of your course textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so here's the bad dad joke time. So bear with me, and here it goes. How would we recognize a quote-unquote rough neighborhood, right? So somebody may say, I grew up in a rough neighborhood. Well, that's an abstract concept. What exactly does it mean to be a rough neighborhood? So as a researcher, we would have to think, what are the signs that I would look for? What would I observe? What might I ask the locals to report about in order to define the difference between a rough neighborhood and a not so rough neighborhood, right? Because there's got to be variability when we collect data so that we have an idea of what we're actually measuring. So we start with this, and on the next screen, you're going to see a silly cartoon. And then let's imagine, how do we measure a rough neighborhood? Well, almost instinctively, Alan could sense that this was going to be a rough neighborhood. So how do we measure a rough neighborhood? Well, we measure it by, the hats the locals wear. All right, enough with the bad dad jokes. But as you can see here in this cartoon, if you don't get it, all the bully looking guys that are sitting over there on their side with their arms crossed and hanging on the fence, they have, what do they have? They have cat hats. And then poor little Alan's got a mouse hat. Okay, you get the joke. Okay, but the idea here is, what do we look for with whatever we're measuring? Because we measure really abstract things. And we want to, especially as criminal justice researchers, be able to articulate and explain to our audience information about the world we live in, especially when it comes to crime and deviance and drug use and things of that nature. So let's review this idea called operationalization. So on the left, as you may recall from our previous lectures, in the oval, we have a construct. That is an abstract idea for our research question or our hypotheses. It's one of the key components that we want to study. So let's say we want to study parental influence. So all of us were kids at one point in time, and we were raised, and whether it was our parents or grandparents, adopted parents, in-laws, whatever, we've had those sort of parental figures in our life, and we know what it's like to, you have a general sense of like, did my parents have an influence on me? Well, by looking at that, if I say I want to measure parental influence, say I'm doing a study where I want to examine are children who are raised in a household where there's a stronger parental influence, does that have a good outcome for them? Or if the parental influence is negative, does it have a bad outcome for them? But I'm thinking, well, how do I actually start to get a concrete, clear, objective measure of parental influence? So what we have below here are 3 examples of how I might consider operationalizing this construct of parental influence. So the first, we may figure out or design a study where we measure the number of hours spent with parents each week, right? Whether this is done in sort of a diary format, whether it's done in sort of a survey format, a survey question, like how many hours you spend with your parents each week, you can imagine that the more time you spent with your parents, the more influence they're going to have. But we'll come back to that. Another way that we may measure parental influence is the number of hours each day when the parents know where their child is. So, and we may ask that question, okay, so if I ask a question, how often do your parents know exactly where you are? Like, did you have to check in? Or if you, in the day we live in now with cell phones and things of that nature, was there a way for them to keep track of you? Or finally, we have the opportunity of how often do you follow parental suggestions? Say we have a survey question that is set up that way, and then we have sort of a scale of responses available to the particular subject who's answering this question. So each one of these, I hope you get the idea that we're trying to get some sort of concrete measure of parental influence. But there's never a perfect answer. And oftentimes, especially with something as abstract as a concept as parental influence, we may want to have in a survey, we may want to have 3, 4, 5, 6 or more questions to capture that entire concept because it's a rather complex concept. If we're doing something that is more of an observational thing, we may be looking to observe multiple characteristics in order to measure this thing called parental influence. Now, as a researcher, one of the things we have to remember is there's going to be flaws, and rarely do you get that perfect way to measure a particular construct. So let's go through each one of these things again and look at some of their strengths and weaknesses. So the first one, number of hours spent with parents each week. Okay, so obviously I think a lot of us would agree that the more time you spend around your parents, the more time they're with you and you're talking with them, going through daily life activities, they are going to have an influence on you. But the negative side is you go, okay, well, but just because I spend time with my parents, if I'm just being carted around while they're doing their errands and going to work, and I'm sitting there staring at an iPad or staring at my phone and not paying attention to them, then maybe that's not a perfect measure of parental influence. Same thing with the second one. If I just simply say number of hours each day when parents know where their child is, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the parents are having an influence on you. That's just the parents know where you're at. So these are this idea of like, are our variables, our questions, are they actually capturing that idea of the construct? And arguably, I think the third one may be one of the strongest choices as a way to operationalize parental influence. How often do you follow your parental suggestions? Right? I mean, if you know that your parents have always told you, look both ways before you cross the street, or don't talk to strangers or whatever, that is a way. If you answer that final question saying, yeah, I follow my parents' suggestions a lot, that is an idea that clearly they're having an influence in your life. Whereas if you're going, screw them, I don't want to deal with them, and I'm going to do the exact opposite of what they say, obviously they're not having that much of an influence, or maybe they are, but they're just pushing you the wrong way. So the key thing here is always recognizing that the idea of operationalization is a gray area. There is no, it's not a black and white, yes, no. It is very much, as a researcher, you have to decide in a particular time and setting what's the best way to capture this thing. Let's move over to the right-hand side. So one of the things that, and once again, this speaks to a lot of things that are going on in society right now, is this notion of racial tension. Well, how do I measure that? Right? I mean, if I say, ooh, there was a lot of racial tension at that demonstration that I went to, or that rally that I went to, and people go, okay, I get it. But do they really get it? Do they really understand the notion of what exactly it means to sort of capture this notion of racial tension? So here are just two really quick examples of how we might start to consider how to operationalize this concept of racial tension. So the first I have is we may imagine that if we were doing sort of a city level or county level or state level data collection, sort of what we call aggregate level data, we may try to measure the number of race-related hate crimes that were reported to police within the past 6 months. And we may consider that to be a sign of racial tension. And the question in the back of our mind is always, is that really an indicator of racial tension, or is it an indicator of some other construct? And that's one of the tough things with what we do in this field. Or I may ask on a survey something along the idea of, asking an individual, what percentage of social ills do you think are caused by another race? Now, is that racial tension that I'm measuring, or is it racism that I'm measuring, or is it some other construct? And that's always going to be the one thing that I will come back to over and over and over again, is this idea of not everyone is going to agree with how things are operationalized from one study to the next. But these are just a few examples of how we attempt to go from that abstract into that more concrete way of measurement. All right, so why do I talk about this thing called measurement theory? Well, especially in our field, we often attempt to measure constructs that are very abstract, to give it a simple word. So what do I mean by abstract? Well, they're hard to see, hard to ask about, hard to get honest answers for. So what do I mean by this? Well, racial profiling. Well, when we talk about law enforcement and somebody says, there's racial profiling going on, and they're pulling over individuals of a certain ethnicity or race or sex or whatever it may be, and that's racial profiling, then we may say, oh, that's definitely what it is. But is it always potentially racial profiling, or is it people looking for signs of somebody behaving in an inappropriate or illegal manner? And so there's never going to be 100% agreement, but it's a tough thing to wrap our mind around. Gang membership. One of the things that I know is, as an individual who grew up in the 1980s and early 1990s, seeing the sort of the growth of these gang sort of profiles of law enforcement at the city, county, and state level. We're trying to member or sort of document who were gang members, who weren't. Even that is not always tried and true and easy to explain thing. You have true hardcore gang members, but you also have peripheral people who are associated with the gang but really aren't one of the members. And then you have the wannabes who want to claim that they're one of the gang members. So that's another tough thing. Prison rape. Back in the Prison Rape PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, that came through, probably about 15 years ago now, I'm thinking, was trying to identify what is the true numbers and rate of prison rape and sexual assaults within our state prisons. Trying to measure that was hard because people would lie about it. People would underreport it, potentially overreport it. Hollywood movies have always made it one of the key things with almost every prison movie has to have some sexual assault or prison rape scene. That seemed like the standard go-to. So how do we get an accurate measure? Because that's a really sensitive thing to ask people about, especially tough men who, are trying to show their masculine side, trying to get honest answers about it. Police brutality, another tough thing to measure. At what point did the police go over the line? And I don't mean to keep bringing up our current events, but there are moments where it becomes brutally clear that they've overstepped the lines. But there are other moments where it's kind of a gray area. It's hard to know, did this officer truly overstep the lines, or were they acting in a manner that was in line with what their requirements and duties were as a law enforcement officer, and were they trying to get the job done and protect the public? So there can be gray areas. Domestic violence, hard to see, right? You ask people about domestic violence, even victims, sadly, it's tough, or it's hard for them to talk about it. You're bringing up very sensitive topics. Sometimes they feel shame. They're hidden. They still have fear, so they may not report it. So when we're trying to get honest answers about domestic violence, it's hard to get at it. Personal drug use. You can imagine if somebody's a heavy, hardcore drug user, they may be scared about being completely honest about that because of the potential repercussions that can be handed down to them through societal stigmatization, or the threat of losing a job, or family members being, angry at them. So a lot of these things that we look for are not just, oh, what did you have for breakfast? What is your favorite color? How many times do you brush your teeth a day, right? We don't ask questions about that often in criminal justice. We ask about very sensitive and abstract areas. So the thing that we as researchers need to always remember is, what do I do? Whether it's asking a question on a survey, whether it's observing somebody's social behavior or their physical behavior, we're looking for an indicator of its presence, right? And one of the things that I think is always a good example, when you think about if you're a law enforcement officer and I come up upon somebody who pull them over for a traffic infraction, and I walk up to the side of the car and I look at that person driving the car, they're looking for indicators of certain things. Do they seem overly nervous? Do they seem like they're under the influence of something? So you're looking for bloodshot eyes, slurred speech, inability to control themselves, overly sweating on a cold day, all sorts of things. Same thing as a researcher, we're always looking for an indicator of this underlying construct. And that's kind of the background of what measurement theory is and the importance of operationalization. All right, so sort of as a wrap up of a couple of these ideas. So how do we get an indicator of a construct's presence? So we have to think of always in the back of our mind as a researcher, whenever we're collecting data and conducting research, we have to consider a few things. Do our measures, the measures meaning the data we're collecting, actually represent and reflect the concepts we want them to? Or do they reflect the presence of something else? Like, are we completely measuring some other thing? And I'll give some ideas of that in a couple slides. We also have to ask ourselves, are our measures consistent over time, across settings, and among different populations, right? Across different time periods, across different cultures, different societies, behavior can be construed in completely different ways. Even the concept of sort of love and respect, or love within a family, isn't always shown the same way across different cultures. Sometimes, as a parent, I can speak to this. It's one thing if you see a parent hugging their child, telling them that how sweet they are, giving them a kiss on the head, you go, oh, that's a sign of love. But sometimes, and we all know the term tough love, sometimes love has to be shown in appropriately reprimanding a child so that they can learn to do the right thing. So when we think about how we measure things, we want to see the best measures should be applicable across over time, across different settings, and amongst different populations. And remember, if our measures don't truly reflect the constructs of interest, the results of our study are basically crap. They are going to be inaccurate and misleading, right? If you go in there saying, I measured whatever it may be that you're looking for, and you're measuring something completely different, then whatever you say about the results, that's not going to be effective. So, how do we make sure that we're getting accurate data and that our measures are good? Well, the two sort of go-to things that we need to consider are reliability and validity. And these are so important that we're actually going to spend 2 more lectures breaking down each one and talking about the various ways in which we as researchers can assess the level of reliability and the level of validity for a particular study. So let's start with reliability. And reliability is actually arguably the easier one to measure. And reliability, in its fancy definition, is the degree to which scores are free from errors of measurement. Okay, great, sounds good. What I want all of you to consider when you think of reliability in the realm of research is reliability is all about consistency. Am I being consistent in how I'm collecting my data? Am I measuring things in the same way, the same fashion each time? All right, and one of the things about this, if you kind of have ever, let's say, we'll do this example. This is the easy go-to. We'll talk about the good old-fashioned weight scale. All right, so some of you may have a scale at home in your bathroom or your closet or wherever, and every once in a while you step on it to see how much you weigh. All right, that's your scale. Other times you go to the doctor's office. They have a scale oftentimes when you first check in. They have you step on the scale to check your weight, right? So the key thing here is, have you ever stepped onto a scale and go, there's no way that's right? like that's either way too high or way too low. Is it being consistent, right? Different types of scales are going to have different consistencies. So if I'm conducting a study, I would imagine if I wanted to measure everyone's weight, I would want to use the same scale over and over again. Why? Because it's consistent. Even if it happens to be a little bit, oh, it over measures everyone, as long as it's consistent, it measures them over, everyone is measured a little bit heavy or everyone's measured a little bit light. But if I go into my cheap scale that I got at the CVS or the fancy scale that was at the doctor's office, once we start changing our forms of measurement, we threaten losing consistency. And even the same way when it comes to survey questions, people will respond differently if I ask them a question orally, right? And in face-to-face interview, if I ask somebody a question, they may respond in a certain way. If I give them that exact same question on a paper and pencil survey, you can imagine there may be differences in how they respond to it. Add in a third component. What if I ask that exact same question on a keyboard and a computer? That may change how they respond to it, right? Because it's the setting, it's their comfort with whatever technology that the question's being presented to. It's the general environment. Do they feel a sense of privacy, of anonymity, or do they feel like they're being watched? You can imagine there's a lot of things that go into the consistency of how we collect data. And so the first thing we have is this thing called reliability, and we're going to be talking a lot more about that. The second one, and this is arguably the even more important one, is validity. Now, validity, the fancy definition is refers to the appropriateness, meaningfulness, and usefulness of the specific inferences made from the measure. Once again, I'm all about simplicity, and I like the idea when we think about validity in this course, think about accuracy. Am I hitting the target that I'm shooting for? Are we measuring what we actually want to measure? Right? If I want to measure empathy in a survey, I need to hit the target of what exactly empathy is. If I want to measure cold-heartedness, are you a cold-hearted individual or not? I need to make sure my questions specifically hit that construct and not something else. If I want to measure entitlement, I want to make sure that my questions measure that and hit the nail on the head. And I will be sharing with you some examples from the TCU, the Texas Christian University's criminal thinking scales, which I think is a really good example of how they measure some rather abstract constructs with 6 or 7 questions per construct, and you can kind of assess the, do they seem like they're consistent in how they go about it, and do they appear to be accurate? The final thing I'll say about reliability and validity, and as I said, we'll talk more about them in detail, is one way to visualize it is think about that good old-fashioned bullseye. The bullseye, I mean like the target if somebody was going with a bow and arrow or with a gun or a slingshot or whatever. And they go out to a range and there's a target out there with the various circles getting smaller and smaller and smaller, or like a dartboard too, down to that very center bullseye. Reliability isn't about are you hitting the center of the target. Reliability is more about are you just being consistent. So I may miss the target, the center of the target every time, but if my shots, whether they be BB gun shots or the darts I'm throwing, if they are clustering in one corner of that overall target, even if it's not the center of the target, that's consistent. You can imagine if they have a nice tight little cluster and you're consistently a little bit high into the left, you're reliable. You're not accurate, but you're reliable. Whereas validity, that requires that I'm actually hitting the center of that target. I'm really getting at what I need to hit. All right, and we'll be talking about these two concepts in a lot more detail in the lectures to come. So now let's break down the idea of what are the components of measurement to give us an idea of where does error sneak in. So, and this is I'm a mathematical guy, so I kind of like looking at things from a mathematical point of view. I think it just sort of clarifies things. So don't if you're not a mathematically minded person, don't let this overwhelm you. It's just a conceptual equation. But think about this. That first thing we have on this slide is X. X is the observed score. So I ask somebody, I say, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being I love it, 1 being I hate it, I ask somebody a question, how much do you like watching football on TV? Okay. People are going to give me a response. Somebody goes, oh, I love football. So they give a 10. Somebody goes, it's kind of okay. And they give me a 7. Somebody else says, oh, I don't really like it that much. And they give me a 3, right? So that's our observed score. Somebody responds to that simple question, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like watching football on TV, right? And so we get that observed score. Now, because we have to understand there's always going to be the chance for error. And as researchers, we have to understand that is a critical component of how we go about conducting research. Our X, what we get, what that person responds to, is not necessarily going to be the perfect reflection of the truth. And that's what we're shooting for, is that truth. So that's why we have T, the second thing. That is the unknown true score, the 100% absolute true score. Without a doubt, if I had a crystal ball and I could see everything in the future and everything now, and I could be all-knowing, all-seeing, that's what we're shooting for. We want our X, our observed score, to be as close to the true score, T, as possible. But it doesn't work that way in the real world. When I go out there and ask questions to people, there's going to be problems, right? Even my little watching football on TV question, things can sneak into it. Maybe the person's not having a good day. They're feeling a little bit under the weather. So they're not even paying attention to the question, and they just throw out some score or some number to me. Maybe somebody's favorite football team, just won the Super Bowl, and they are over the top stoked on football, even though they're only a casual fan. So that may push it in one way, right? Maybe their favorite team just lost a pivotal game, and so now they're a little bit pissed off about it. Maybe there's other issues going on. Maybe they just broke up with their girlfriend or their boyfriend who was a fan of Team Y, and they're a fan of Team X, and that messed up their value. Or we caught them on the wrong day. You can imagine, I could go on for days about this, but you get the idea. There are a lot of things that can interfere with how well that simple question, how much do you like watching football on TV, their response at one particular moment in time, how it may not be a perfect reflection of their true feelings. So the 3 things that create the error in that case are the things that we see on here: the ER, the random error, the B, the bias, the W, the non-random error. So each one of these things can lead to the T and the X not being the same value. So when you look at this equation, we see we have X, that's what we get as researchers. And we're hoping it equals T. But there's other things that can get in the way and muddy up the whole entire thing. The random error, which is unpredictable, right? So maybe you just catch them at the wrong time. You never know what's going to happen. Bias, if you're asking a question where somebody may be biased in one way or another, or in the particular situation where they're being asked that question, they feel a need to lean in one way or another. And then finally, the W, which is that non-random error, which is from measuring the wrong construct. So let's take a closer look at each one of those 3 sources of error in measurement. So that ER, that random error, that's the unpredictable. Some days, and think back to that scale example that I talked about before, right? Maybe for whatever reason, it's one scale and you hop on it and it tends to underestimate what your actual weight is. And then on another scale, it tends to come out a little bit heavier. Maybe you've got extra heavy clothes on or something like that, right? So, but it's unpredictable, right? It kind of comes back and forth. If I catch somebody on the wrong day and I ask them, hey, can I ask you a quick question about football and watching TV or whatever? Then maybe if they're in a bad mood, they're going to say one thing, but if you caught them an hour later and they were in a better mood, they might give you a different answer, right? So you can imagine random error is a big part of data collection. And this relates specifically to reliability, right? If our error in measurement and data collection is random, it's inconsistent, right? And I talked about consistency being the big word that relates back to reliability. So one of the things that's good about random error is that if we have a large enough sample, like, so rather than asking 10 people about, do you fear what's going on with COVID-19? Those 10 people could be all over the map. But if I really want to get a pulse of what's going on in my local city or my local state or the nation, maybe I should ask not 10 people, but 100 people or 1,000 people. The more people I ask, this random error tends to cancel out, because it's sort of like everything you get the average over everyone, and that becomes more of an honest picture of what's going on. The next type of error we have is that B, the bias. Now, bias is consistent and predictable. It tends to be in one direction. So the toughest thing about bias is if how you ask the question, or if the topic of the question is something where people are going to have a strong bias in one way or another, this gets into there and it's not really a true reflection. People can hide their feelings when you ask them about certain sensitive topics, racism, things of that nature. And in one moment, they may show their biases, and in another, they may purposely hide their biases. So within the setting, if one of the key things you want to make sure is to reduce bias is we will talk about the importance of standardization of the measures and the observers. So, for example, let's say we're doing an observational study, and I'm asking somebody to assess how many fouls a particular, like LeBron James, famous basketball player, how many fouls he commits in a quarter. And I'm saying, I'm not paying attention to what the referees call. I just want you to sit and watch a quarter of him playing basketball. And every time you see him commit either an offensive or defensive foul, you take a check mark and say, that's 1 foul, 2 foul, 3 foul, etc. Well, if somebody doesn't like LeBron James, you can imagine they're going to look for every little movement that, even if it's not a true foul, they're going to go, that's close enough, I'm going to call it. You get the idea. Somebody who just loves LeBron James and thinks he's the greatest thing ever is going to go, no, that was okay, even if it was a clear-cut red. That's not traveling. No, that's not a charge. That's not a block. And you can imagine that bias creeps into it. So that's why the standardization of how we measure and how we train observers is really important. Finally, we have that W. This is the non-random error. So why is it W? Well, it's from measuring the wrong construct. So this one relates back to validity, which we'll talk in much more detail about in a couple lectures. So validity, remember, was about accuracy. If I'm not shooting at the bullseye, if I'm not hitting the target right in the middle, and I'm shooting somewhere else, then that's non-random error. I could give a brief example of, I went once with a friend to a shooting range, an indoor shooting range, and we set up and put the targets out, and I showed this friend, I lined up, took a handful of shots with the firearm that I had with me, and I was doing okay. I was hitting the target, missing a little bit, but doing all right. My friend comes up, lines up and says, oh, I know how to do this, I'm good. Start shooting, hitting nowhere near the actual target that we had posted at the end of the range. And I start noticing this person is actually like shooting it so high that they're like hitting the top of the ceiling of the place and like ricocheting off. And I asked this person, well, what are you doing? And he goes, well, I'm just shooting and lining up the front point of the firearm towards his target, but realizing that he's not lining up both the rear, the back sight, as well as the front sight. So that, in that case, he wasn't even aiming in the right way or the right spot. So he was being pretty consistent, shooting off the roof of this poor place, but he was not even focused in the right area. That's that non-random error. He was off target, shooting at something else. So you can imagine this was one of the critiques of the IQ test, the initial IQ tests that were used oftentimes with immigrants coming into the country at the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s, was that they don't even really, an IQ test should measure intelligence, But if you don't speak English very well and all the questions are written in advanced English, you're not measuring intelligence, you're measuring your ability to comprehend and understand English. That's a different concept, a different construct, right? Intelligence is one thing, comprehension of English is a different thing. So if your test is written in a way where it's really only measuring comprehension of English, you can see that it's not shooting at the right target if it's supposed to be measuring intelligence. So that's an example of that. All right, let's go ahead and move on to types of measures as we start to wrap up with the last few slides for this one. So whenever we think about, I've got a question, I want to go out and collect data. I have to think about, well, how am I going to collect my data, right? We've already touched on the fact that I have to figure out a way to operationalize each particular construct. I need to figure out how I'm going to measure that in a way to promote the highest level of reliability and the highest level of validity in order for my observed score to match the unknown or the thing I'm seeking out, the true score. So one thing we have to think about is, let's talk about what type of measures are available. So when we think of measurement approaches, there's two key dimensions. There are verbal versus nonverbal. Now, I don't mean this to sound a little misleading, I'm just using the terminology that's used in the field, but verbal doesn't just mean spoken, it means either written or spoken information from the subject. So if I have a face-to-face interview and I talk to somebody, that's verbal. If I hand them a survey and they write a response, that's written, right? So that's the idea of written. So like questionnaires, surveys, face-to-face interviews, things of that nature are what we would call verbal. The flip side of that one is nonverbal. Nonverbal means that I'm not focusing on your words, written or spoken. Rather, I'm focusing on observations of your behavior, right? I can ask somebody, have you been drinking alcohol? And they can lie to me and say, nope, even if they're very drunk. But I could do a nonverbal measurement approach and observe their behavior. If they're slurring their words, if they reek of alcohol, if they can't walk a straight line, that may be an indicator. Remember, that's what we're doing with measurement, looking for indicators. That may be an indicator that they're under the influence. I can do physiological measures, right? So once again, using sort of the alcohol example, things like a breathalyzer, a blood test, things of that nature, a urine test can give me a measure without relying on the written or the spoken word. If I'm looking at things more of like asking people about experiences from their past, what were you like as a student? You can imagine a verbal approach would be like having survey questions like, how well did you do in school? Did you get along with other individuals, et cetera, et cetera? Or I could go to their actual old school records, look at their old transcripts, look to see were they ever expelled or suspended? Did they receive certain awards, things of that nature? And those are on that nonverbal side. Then on the other dimension, the second dimension of measures, we have obtrusive versus unobtrusive. So obtrusive measurements occur when the subject is aware that data are being collected. So if I have a survey and I hand it to you, you know data is being collected. If I interview you, you know data is being collected. If I poke you with a needle to draw some blood to have it analyzed, you know you're being that data are being collected. That's the obtrusive side. On the other side, we have unobtrusive. Unobtrusive is where the subject is the opposite. Subject is unaware that data are being collected. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I have a surveillance camera set up and I record things where people don't know that they're being filmed, that's unobtrusive. If I have just general observations in a certain setting, or even if I ask questions in a social setting, but the person doesn't know that I'm asking those questions for research purposes, that would be more on the unobtrusive. And you can imagine we just wrapped up the ethics lecture, and you can understand that, hopefully you understand that unobtrusive measures, you got to be careful, because if the subject is unaware, you have to worry about ethical requirements and guidelines. But we'll touch on that more going forward. All right, so both of these dimensions, the verbal, nonverbal, as well as the obtrusive, unobtrusive dimensions, are important for a key term that we talk about in research, which is known as reactivity. What is reactivity? Well, reactivity is the extent to which a measure causes a change in the behavior of the subject. What do I mean by that? Well, if you know you're taking part in a research study, you can imagine that people can lie, they may get nervous, they may try to be better than they normally are on something, or act nicer than they truly are, may not express their true feelings, all sorts of things. All of these things is if you know you're being measured or data are being collected from you, you may react and behave differently than you normally would. That's a problem. That affects validity, because if you react and put on a whole different face and act like you love cats. Oh, cats are the cutest things in the world. I like watching kitty cat videos, blah, 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 because you know the person is interested in studying people's, affinity towards cats, and you're trying to impress that person, and you talk about how great cats are, blah, 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 but in reality, you despise cats. You think that they're scum of the earth. You don't like them at all. Well, that's reactivity. You were playing up to that moment to impress the researcher or to give them what they wanted to hear. And that means that they are no longer measuring your love or admiration for cats. Rather, they're measuring your desire to be socially accepted and to say the socially appropriate things. And without going into more details, once again, look around the world that we're living in today in summer of 2020, and I think you can get an idea of how it's so important for us to collect data where the data we collect is as honest and reliable and valid as possible. All right, so this just has an example of how various types of measurement approaches you might see in the realm of research methods may play out into these two dimensions. And you'll see in the left-hand column, we have the verbal row and the nonverbal row. And then across the top row, we have the two columns of obtrusive and unobtrusive. So an example of research data collection approaches that would be verbal and obtrusive would be things like questionnaires, interviews, and surveys, right? It's verbal, we're collecting either written word or spoken word from people, and the individuals, the subjects, know that the data is being collected from them. But oftentimes, if we want to go a little bit deeper and we still want to analyze sort of the written or spoken words of individuals, so still verbal, but make it a little bit unobtrusive, there are things like content analysis. So content analysis we'll talk about later in the course, but it's where we sort of analyze the written or sung or spoken or taped material of various individuals. So oftentimes you'll see content analysis done for speeches made by individuals, or recordings made by individuals when they didn't know that they were being watched. So we can look a little bit deeper into what they're actually saying. Are they implying certain things? And this is also why it's so important that, especially in today's day and age where it feels like everything is recorded, you got to be careful what you say on social media and things of that nature, because you never know when the content is going to come back to be analyzed by somebody who is going to hire you or potentially hire you, or for some other reason. Then we move down to the nonverbal obtrusive box. So nonverbal means that we're collecting information from you, but it's still obtrusive. You know that information is being collected. So different types of physiological measures: blood, lie detectors, EEG tests, things of that nature. You know you're hooked up to something, or you know somebody's drawing blood from you, but it's nonverbal in the sense we're not relying on your spoken words or your written words. And then nonverbal unobtrusive physical traces. Think of a crime scene. In order to know, was Bob here at that crime? Well, they go into a crime scene. Do they find hair, blood, other sorts of physical traces that may have been left behind that belong to Bob? Archival records, sort of the medical records, school records, things of that nature. And nowadays, I think, as far as the nonverbal unobtrusive, things like your social media, right? Whether you think you deleted it, your social media posts from 5-10 years ago, guess what? Somebody can find those somewhere. And so a lot of research, we notice things like that are ways to get sort of an accurate thing. And remember, the sort of the takeaway from all this is our key thing is with any measurement is reliability and validity. We want to get the most consistent and accurate information about whatever it is. And the various ways of how we select our measures, we have to find the balance between maintaining an ethical approach, but also making sure we're getting the most accurate information possible. And so we have to sort of, it's this balance game that we have to play on a regular basis. A simple example before we wrap up on the next slide is the idea of, think about, once again, that idea of a law enforcement officer sees a car driving someone erratically, suspects the person may be under the influence, pulls them over to the side of the road just to do a check. And there's various ways an officer can sort of go about finding out whether or not you are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, right? They can do a verbally obtrusive approach and ask you questions. And you think about the good and the bad of that. They can also do some of that, like a nonverbal but obtrusive approach. They can do a blood test. They can do a breathalyzer test. They can do a urine test. They can also do sort of other sort of like observational stuff where they're looking at, ask you to do a field sobriety test. And as you see, we always think about what is the most accurate. I think most of us would argue somebody may just not have the best balance. They may have other issues going on where they fail a field sobriety test. Maybe they sound like their speech is slurred, but it doesn't always mean that they're under the influence. So the most accurate is going to be a blood test, right? But a blood test is obtrusive. And obtrusive stuff always, especially when we expand that out to the realm of research, can have ethical issues. Right now, obviously, in the case of a law enforcement officer pulling somebody over, it's a different range of ethical issues as opposed to somebody just signing up to participate in a standard research study. But it kind of gives you an idea of the various types of ways that we might think about measuring a simple construct, or an idea of, like, inebriation. If that's the construct, there's various ways we can go about doing that. All right. And finally, let's talk about this idea of reactivity in the measurement type. And I kind of gave a glimpse of this on the last slide. So we had the idea of the verbal versus nonverbal. Well, clearly, a verbal approach, you can lie. You can control, you can change, you can try to play to the audience in anything that is written or spoken. Whereas your unspoken stuff, your nonverbal information, it's harder to lie with nonverbal. So my simple little example here is like the idea of, like, the law enforcement, a urine test is going to be better than simply asking somebody how much have you had to drink today or tonight or whatever. So one of the things with that, but obviously when it comes to the ethical side, it's a lot easier to get IRB approval for a survey that simply asks people about their drug and alcohol consumption, as opposed to asking them to submit to urine tests. And then same thing with the obtrusive, unobtrusive. Obviously, subjects are not going to be as reactive to unobtrusive measures because they don't know that they're being measured. So unknown surveillance, if we want to do observational research, is going to be more accurate than people know that they're being watched, right? I imagine, hopefully, I don't know about right now with all the shutdowns going on, but at some point in your life, hopefully you've had a chance to experience the joy of jobs and working, right? So imagine you work as a bartender or a waiter or waitress or a barista, or you work in a clothing store or whatever it may be. At some point in your life, you've had one of these jobs. And I think most of us know that when the boss is around, we're going to be on our best behavior, right? Or if you know that you're up for like an employment review and this is that obtrusive thing. You know you're being watched. You're going to do your absolute best, or at least try to do your absolute best. But when the boss isn't around, no one seems to be there, and you're just handling the shop on your own, a lot of people may not exactly behave in the exact same manner. So if we could watch them when they're doing that, when they don't know that they're being watched with unknown surveillance in that unobtrusive way, we may actually get a more accurate picture of who they are and how they behave. But once again, the unobtrusive, that unknown surveillance is going to have a lot of ethical considerations, right? So these are the things to talk about that we will see sort of going in as we dive deeper and deeper into scrutinizing different types of measurement. So we will hear the terms operationalization coming up nonstop. Reliability and validity are going to be backbones to this class. And finally, this idea of reactivity. And how do I do the best that I can while still maintaining an ethical approach to get the measurements and the data that is the least reactive as possible, meaning that I'm getting an honest reaction, not something where they can change and play to the camera or change their behavior in a false manner. So take care, and I will see you with the next lecture.